Have you ever been touched by acts of kindness in your life? Then this story is for you. Nearly 80 years ago, the Nazis invaded Poland and besieged the city of Warsaw. Thousands were wounded and the hospitals were full to overflowing. Nurses were scarce and volunteers from all walks of life were pressed into service. One nursing volunteer was Martha Corwin, a concert pianist. She chose night duty, a time the sick and dying seemed especially in need of a friend. She walked up and down the wards trying to find small ways she could bring comfort to those in pain. Sometimes it was as simple as just being there to listen to the patient talk, or holding a glass as he or she sipped water. Late one night, she was going through the wards when she noticed a soldier with his face buried in his pillow, sobbing. His cries were muffled, but his big shoulders shook with his grief. Martha stopped at the foot of his bed and wondered what she could do. She looked down at her hands. These hands can bring music out of a piano, causing the strings to vibrate in harmony, she mused. I wonder if these same hands could somehow quiet the turmoil of his soul and bring harmony and peace in the midst of his pain. Let me try. She walked nearer the soldier, taking his head in her hands, hoping that they might bring him some comfort and healing. He grabbed her hands quickly in his own, digging his nails into her palms. Oh Lord, please help some harmony to flow into his soul to alleviate his pain, Martha prayed silently. The soldier's sobs gradually subsided. His hands relaxed their grip. Within moments, he was asleep. His breathing was steady and peaceful. Martha knew that God had used her hands to bring the miracle of rest and relief from pain. Colossians 3 verse 12 says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." So friends, when someone is hurting and you don't know what to say, try a tender touch on the shoulder or a squeeze of the hand. God can work miracles through our hands.
I must tell you a story that happened a long time ago. It was only a country vicarage that was burned, an old thatched wooden building, yet the fire was one of the most memorable in England's history. In the house at the time was quite a large family, consisting of a mother, a father, and several children. Among the little children was a little boy called John, a bright, happy little fellow, only 6 years old, yet destined to become one of the greatest and best-known men of his time. It was on February 9, 1709, that the fire was discovered. The family was sleeping peacefully, when suddenly the terrible cry of "Fire! Fire! Fire!" awakened them all to a sense of imminent danger. Dry as tinder, the house was soon a mass of flames, with smoke billowing forth from every window. Mother and father snatched the sleepy children from their bed and rushed them outside to safety. So hurriedly indeed did they work, and so great was the panic that there was no time to think of clothes, and some found themselves in the garden without anything on at all except for the night clothes in which they had been sleeping. There was more than $100 in silver and gold in the house, and mother was anxious to go back and get it, but father refused to let her go, saying it was better that the money perish than that so great a risk should be taken. By this time, All the village had been aroused, and scores of people had gathered as near as possible to watch the thrilling drama of the flames. Suddenly, from the lips of all, there came a cry of astonishment and terror, for there, at one of the bedroom windows, appeared the pale, frightened face of a child. It was little John. In all the terror and confusion of that dreadful night, he had been forgotten. Awaking to hear the strange sounds, he thought and found his room full of light and thought the day had come. Then he had seen flames racing across the ceiling of his room, and springing out of bed, he had run to the door, only to be beaten back by smoke and fire. Finding his escape cut off, he had hurried to the window, and standing on a chair, had peered out into the sea of the frightened, upturned faces beneath him. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" cried poor little John. Now father saw him, and in the frenzy of anxiety, dashed into the building once more, and attempted to climb the stairs. Putting his trousers over his head, he bravely tried to force his way in, but in vain. He was driven back by the choking fumes, and in despair fell upon his knees in the hall and cried to God to save the child. Oh, for a ladder! There was none, and escape for little John now seemed impossible. Every moment, the hungry, crackling flames drew nearer to his poor, white, fear-stricken face. The glare of the fire was reflected in the terrified faces of the onlookers, who stood helpless in the lane. A few of them shouted suggestions that were lost in the raging roar of the blazing roof. Could nothing be done before it would be forever too late? Suddenly, a man in the crowd moved forward by the thought of his impending tragedy, dashed forward and took his stand underneath the window where little John was calling piteously for help. Bending his back, this gallant man called upon another to spring upon his broad shoulders. The second man obeyed, only in his hurry, he had fallen to the ground. Rising, he made another attempt, this time succeeding. By reaching up as far as he could, he was able to clutch John's eager, outstretched hands and drag him outside to safety. Saved! A cry of joy and thankfulness rose from the crowd, echoed in the building itself, by the awful crash of the roof, as a moment later, it fell through the floor where John had just been standing. By a miracle of providence, no one was hurt. "Come, neighbors," cried the thankful father. Despite the lateness of the hour and the confusion of that and the terror of the night, let us kneel down. Let us give thanks to God, for He has given me my 8 children safe and sound. Let the house go. I am rich enough. And while tears of joy ran many a face, they knelt and thanked God for His goodness while the fire burned itself out. John never forgot that dreadful night. How could he? Somehow, it colored all of his afterlife. When he grew up, he became a very powerful preacher. He used to speak of himself as a branch plucked from the burning. He always felt that God must have great purpose for his life to save him so wonderfully in his childhood. Surely God had a great work for him to do, for this little John became the great John Wesley, whose name is now known all over the world, preaching to the poor in the fields and in the city streets. He brought great spiritual revival to England, and in the 18th century, saved the country from the horrors of the French Revolution. While the thirsty revolutionaries in France were singing the Marseillaise, the poor people of England were singing, Jesus, lover of my soul, which was taught to them by John Wesley and his brother Samuel. How great was the deed of that unknown man who bent his back at that night and made a ladder to save a little child. Who can tell the worth of a child? How precious children are today, how great they may become tomorrow. 2 Timothy 1 verse 10, He has saved us and called us not to a holy life, not because of anything we have done, but because of His own purpose and grace. Boys and girls, brothers and sisters, God has a purpose for you also, that you too may become great in His service in days to come. We are all as brands plucked from the burning, that we someday may blaze with heavenly light in this dark old world. Thank you.
Stories have always fascinated a lot of us. However, there are stories that stand out and deeply impacted our lives. This story is one of those. I hope it resonates with you as it has with me. A wealthy man loved to collect rare works of art. They had everything in their collection, from Picasso to Raphael. They would often sit together and admire the great works of art. When the Vietnam conflict broke out, the son went to war. He was very courageous and died in battle while rescuing another soldier. The father was notified and grieved deeply for his only son. About a month later, just before Christmas, there was a knock at the door. A young man stood at the door with a large package in his hands. He said, "Sir, you don't know me, but I am the soldier for whom your son gave his life. He saved many lives that day, and he was carrying me to safety when a bullet struck him in the heart, and he died instantly. He often talked about you and your love for art." The young man held out his package. "I know this isn't much. I'm not really a great artist, but I think your son would have wanted you to have this." The father opened the package. It was the portrait of his son, painted by the young man. He stared in awe at the way the soldier had captured the personality of his son in the painting. The father was so drawn to the eyes that his own eyes welled up with tears. He thanked the young man and offered to pay him for the picture. "Oh no, sir, I could never repay what your son did for me. It's a gift." The father hung the portrait over his mantle. Every time visitors came to his home, he took them to see the portrait of his son before he showed them any of the other great works he had collected. The man died a few months later. There was to be a great auction of his paintings. Many influential people gathered, excited to see the great paintings and having an opportunity to purchase one for their collection. On the platform sat the painting of the son. The auctioneer pounded his gavel. "We will start the bidding with this picture of the son. Who will bid for this picture?" There was silence. Then a voice in the back of the room shouted, "We want to see the famous painting. Skip this one." But the auctioneer persisted. "Will someone bid for this painting? Who will start the bidding?" 100, 200. Another voice shouted angrily, "We didn't come to see this painting. We came to see the Van Goghs, the Rembrandts. Get on with the real bids." But still, the auctioneer continued, the son, who'll take the son?" Finally, a voice from the very back of the room. It was the longtime gardener of the man and his son. "I'll give $10 for the painting." Being a poor man, it was all he could afford. "We have $10. Who will bid 20? "Give it to him for 10. Let's see the masters." $10 is the bid. "Won't someone bid 20? The crowd was becoming angry. They didn't want the picture of the son. They wanted the more worthy investments for their collections. The auctioneer pounded the gavel. "Going once, going twice, sold for $10. A man sitting on the second row shouted, "Now, let's get on with the collection." The auctioneer laid down his gavel. "I'm sorry, the auction is over." "What about the paintings?" "I'm sorry. When I was called to conduct this auction, I was told of a secret stipulation in the will. I was not allowed to reveal the stipulation until this very time. Only the painting of the sun would be auctioned. Whoever bought that painting would inherit the entire estate, including the paintings. The man who took the sun gets everything." John 3 verse 16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." God gave his Son 2,000 years ago to die on a cruel cross. Much like the auctioneer, his message today is, the Son, who'll take the Son. Because you see, whoever takes the Son gets everything.